All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This is the fourth session of the Racial Justice Summit that is dealing with racial justice and government. Yesterday, we had conversations about health, conversations about education and policing. And today we will be starting off with government. My name is Neethan Shan. I'm the Executive Director of Urban Alliance on Race Relations. Just before we get started, I would like to let you know that there's simultaneous translation from English to French, French to English. You can access that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a globe interpretation button, and you can pick your choice. Most of the session will be in English. There might be parts of it that might be in French. So just giving you a heads up. Before we formally begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session from Scarborough, which is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Before we get into our session, today's event and the summit, this two-day summit is made possible by the support of many amazing sponsors, and we are able to provide vast majority of the attendees to be able to attend free because of their support. So we'll quickly view a video that acknowledges our sponsors right now. Thank you. So our sincere thanks to all of our sponsors for supporting the summit. As I mentioned, this session will focus on the theme of racial justice and government, and brings together three experts in the field doing this work at the three levels of government. The anti-racism work has been set up in these levels of government in a certain format, and representatives from those structures are here. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today, and I hope you will all benefit from the insightful and knowledgeable speakers who are here today. As you know, the past year and past couple of years, I would say, has seen a rise in public participation in protest and activism regarding anti-racism. This is not new. The communities have been constantly advocating for action from the government, but the pandemic and certain world events as well as local events have given increased attention to dealing with racism. Many systems that have in the past not even mentioned racism are making approaches that are directed towards anti-racism, anti-Black racism. So today we're going to ask the representatives about these questions. And we also want to acknowledge that this current pressure to act has come from grassroots organizing that has been taking place. It didn't come directly out of the goodwill of the government. And so those activists who have put their life, put their opportunities, put many things on the line to advocate to get this action are being acknowledged right now. So let's get started into asking our panelists some questions to start with. But before that, let me introduce our panelists. We have three amazing individuals who are champions for anti-racism work within their own governments. Peter Flegel is the Executive Director of the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, a cornerstone of Canada's anti-racism strategy. With his team, Peter is driving whole of government system change in the federal government from an anti-racism perspective. Peter has distinguished history of leadership in the government, NGO, philanthropic sectors in areas including anti-racism, equity, human rights, innovation, culture, international affairs, and entrepreneurship. Welcome, Peter. And
thank you.
Nisha Haji is the Director, Policy and Programs at Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate, where she works across the provincial government and with community stakeholders and partners to identify, address, and prevent systemic racism in government policies, programs, and services. In this role, Nisha also oversees the development and implementation of a new $1.6 million grant focused on increasing awareness of racism and hate. Nisha has a passion for better public services and improving outcomes for the people we serve. Welcome, Nisha. And we have Rowena Santos, who's a proud Bramptonian, inspired by community and driven by passion to change the culture of politics to move the city forward. She was elected in 2018 and is the first Filipino elected to council in Brampton. Rowena holds an honors BBA, a degree from the Schulich School of Business and Masters in Sustainable Development and Environmental Planning from London School of Economics. She also has held many leadership roles across the private, not-for-profit, public sectors, and has mentored countless youth to be politically active across the GTA. Rowena is the vice chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism Committee at the region of Peel. She's an active member of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities representing the city of Brampton. She's the vice chair of the Anti-Racism and Equity Committee and the Municipal Finance and Intergovernmental Relations Committee. Thank you to all three of you for taking the time to be here and to be part of this conversation. You know, when we set up this session, we had set it up with different themes, as you saw, you know, health, education, and so on. This is a kind of an outlier kind of theme, you know, government. And one of the things we wanted to focus is that the different levels of government have had some response. And part of the response has been the work that you're doing. And we wanted to kind of talk about it, highlight it, but also kind of figure out what's next from each of those initiatives. So why don't we start with each of you first, starting to talk a little bit about how the government has been responding at your level and how your role fits in within that government. What are some of the things that are happening at the structural level to address particularly systemic racism within those levels? And maybe I'll start with Peter.
Merci. Donc, je suis vraiment ravi d'être avec vous ce matin. Je me joins avec vous à partir du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. So I'm really delighted to be here with you today, joining you from the traditional and unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. First, I'd like to congratulate the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and, of course, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for coming together to host such a crucial discussion on racial justice in government, because this discussion is so crucial at a time when there are global efforts to roll back the clock on efforts being led by communities across the country and around the world to stamp out systemic racism and hate. So it's really important. So the first thing I'd like to say and tell you is that the government of Canada remains steadfast in its commitment to eradicating systemic racism, discrimination, and hate across the nation. The government stands determined to work with you and thousands of organizations led by and serving diverse communities with lived experience of racism to accomplish this task. As you are probably aware, as a first step, the government committed to $45 million in 2019 to Canada's anti-racism strategy, a 3-year strategy, which was really built by consulting communities with lived experience of racism. And a centerpiece of that strategy was the creation of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, which is mandated to lead a whole-of-government approach to addressing systemic racism and racial discrimination, which means helping federal organizations across the board understand the impact of their initiatives on diverse communities, working with them to identify and then counter the systemic barriers that they may reinforce, and most importantly, working with federal organizations to kickstart new responsive initiatives that address and to seek to remove those barriers and fill gaps. But to really fill this broad mandate and to be blunt, we really depend on you and the tens of thousands of people who have graciously shared their concerns directly with us. Over the last year or so, we've hosted town halls, national summits, and smaller focus groups meetings with literally thousands of representatives from Indigenous peoples, as well as Black, Asian, Muslim, Jewish, racialized, and religious minority communities across Canada. So we've asked you to bring to light the issues that your communities are facing, particularly in the context of COVID-19, to really shed light on the ways in which systemic racism is manifesting itself, and then to provide tangible solutions that we can then bring back to our colleagues in government to advance systems and even societal change. This has been just so critical because we have sought, while acting as a hub, a convener, and a catalyst, to be your voice in government, to make sure that your concerns are heard, and most importantly, to see that your recommendations manage to find their way into policy. And so to answer the crux of your question, through your strong advocacy, whether it is through the Black Lives Matter movement, following the tragic death of George Floyd, the work of Indigenous organizations following the tragic death of Joyce Echaquan, the Stop Asian Hate movement reacting to the spike in anti-Asian hate, the strong denunciations of Islamophobia following the terror attack on the family in London, Ontario, and many other initiatives that you've been involved in. Your voices have been heard. How, you may ask? Well, from that initial $45 million investment, we've seen a multi-million-dollar increase in federal government commitments, investments to combat racism. We can think of the $760 million Indigenous Community Support Fund to address the impact of COVID on Indigenous peoples, over $300 million investment in the Black Entrepreneurship Program, $200 million to establish a new Black-led philanthropic endowment fund. Stats Canada is now implementing a disaggregated data action plan based on a $172 million investment. We're talking $21 million for racialized communities legal support initiative to support organizations that are providing free public legal education, information, and legal services to racialized communities. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the $11 million to expand the impact of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, particularly in addressing anti-Asian racism. So ultimately, yes, your voices not only count, they are being heard, but we know that the struggle is not over. We know that more needs to be done, and that is why the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat wants to continue working directly with you to make sure that not only the federal initiatives are being developed, the right ones, but also that they're being implemented in the right way, community-driven, community-informed, and that there is effective monitoring going on. And that is why I really can't stress enough, as we continue to exercise our leadership role across the federal government, we really continue to depend on you for your expert advice, but also for continuing to hold us as a government accountable. So please don't hesitate to tell us when things are not working, when there are gaps, where barriers persist, and we will try to act. That is the only way we can generate collectively fair, equitable, anti-racist, accessible, intersectional, and transformational public policy for a better Canada.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter, for that overview of what's happening at the federal level, particularly through the Anti-Racism the Secretariat. Now we'll move on to the counterpart of the same kind of structure, but obviously set up earlier than the Anti-Racism Secretariat at the federal level, Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate. Nisha, what is happening at the provincial level through your work at Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate?
Thank you so much. I will also say a moment of gratitude for the folks that have been working to set up this event. Having organized conferences, I can appreciate that there's lots of work that goes on. So thank you so much for this really, really critical platform, and appreciate the dialogue and engagement. Also really appreciate the outlier of this session for engaging with government on the conversation on anti-racism. I think it's a really critical one. So thank you for doing that. So in terms of the province, there is a lot going on, as Neethan has mentioned. We've been around for a little bit longer, and in fact are approaching a 5-year mark very shortly in the coming year. I will say that the thing that is really resonating for me in this dialogue that we're having today is this form of pandemic awakening. And what's next? I think it's a really critical moment for government to take note of the space in which the conversation is growing, for the space in which we are seeing the folks that have wanted to get involved more, are learning more, are in this awakening, but a responsibility that rests with us to really determine what's next. So I think that conversation is really, really critical. In terms of what the province of Ontario is doing, just so that there is awareness, Ontario has a legislative framework for the anti-racism initiatives. An Anti-Racism Act was established back in 2017. And the ARD, the Anti-Racism Directorate, which is the lead for the government's implementation of the work related to anti-racism across the public service, is sort of looking at a number of pillars under that Anti-Racism Act. So the one being the ongoing implementation of the current strategy. I think it's important to acknowledge the work has been happening for some time, and the work will continue to happen for a long period of time. And there are particular pillars within the existing anti-racism strategy that we continue to develop and continue to work through. I want to make note of one, which is the establishment of anti-racism data standards, and a framework really that is set up not only for the collection of data, but to support the identification of systemic racism and kind of call for action for those that are leading initiatives within various sectors to then address the racial disparities if, in the process of that data collection framework. So working very closely with our partners in education, in child welfare, and in justice to continue the effort to develop a framework around race-based data collection and to address the racial disparities that are within those three systems. A big component of the work, and I'll say that has been ongoing with the work at the ARD, has been in community collaboration and working in partnership not only with community organizations but with the broader public sector, as well as with Indigenous leadership organizations and communities. So one of the things that we are, or that I can sort of speak to a little bit, is the work that we had done early this year in leading some of the effort that the government had in relation to the COVID response. So the Anti-Racism Directorate led some work to bring together community voices around a communities at risk strategy that really did bring folks to the table from across the health sector as well as community partners to determine what might be the most equitable approach in addressing the racial disparities of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that work really was critical in informing the vaccine rollout and continues to be a part of the Anti-Racism Directorate's work in partnership with the Ministry of Health in kind of looking at our ongoing implementation and considerations that the government is looking forward on. A big other piece on community collaboration and was noted in my in the introduction and in the bio is the work on a very critical program around an anti-racism, anti-hate grant program. First of its kind for the province of Ontario and first of its kind for the Anti-Racism Directorate. This grant program was developed in partnership with community. We took a very strong co-design approach to hear from community organizations and from folks experiencing racism and hate to develop a grant program that will support the initiatives and support the work that is needed to make the change. I'm happy to say that the success of that grant program has looked at doubling the fund, and that grant program is actually $3.2 million at this point, and it was doubled in the 2021 Fall Economic Statement and overview that the province just presented. I will note that the work in the development of the grant program and really and truly insights from community, a critical part of that program was designing a program that's not a one-stop, it's not a one-time grant, and looking at the long-term systemic change that is needed. An element of the grant design is that there was a tiered funding, and one of the tiers of the grant program is actually very specific to systemic change and looking at structural opportunities for change. So larger projects, larger investments in partnership-based grant, and again, a lot of success in terms of the response of that grant program and work that continues there. And then finally, I will mention a number of things that have that the government of Ontario has also been looking at as we move in the conversation from recovery to sort of sustainable change, is looking at the economic space and the economic recovery. There is work to be done at the structural and systemic level, and it will continue to be there, and we will continue to do the work. There is, however, an opportunity in considering the racial disparities and acting upon some of the sectors that we had not been able to include in the conversation on the first strategic plan. And whether that is health or economic recovery, those are a couple of things that we will be looking at. But the additional $5 million that the government has also included for a new grant program in the 2011, again, Fall Economic Statement is an acknowledgement of supports for racialized and Indigenous entrepreneurs, and we will be looking to launch that program in the coming months. So a few investments in a number of different strategic areas to bring us in a place where we can talk about the next phase of the Anti-Racism Directorate's work and the province's contributions. And the core piece being that the province's work is really embedded in a legislative framework. And the anti-racism strategy, the current strategy, is coming to an end in the five-year mark. We are required to consult with community and to engage on the development of that strategy and to review the progress we have made. So we will be looking in the coming months to do a review of the current strategy and to really look forward into what's next for Ontario as it relates to advancing racial equity. So thank you so much for this, and I hope that I'm really looking forward to the conversation in more engagement on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha, for the overview of what's happening at the provincial level. And usually when we do municipal stuff, we kind of default down to City of Toronto, and we've had that in the past many years. What's been happening in the 905 in many places have been disappointing, but what's been happening within Brampton has had some encouraging signs. So we thought, why not bring one of the municipalities from the 905 to start talking about this, because a lot of racialized folks live in the 905 belt, and there are a lot more concerns that are not being addressed. But thanks to the leadership of Councillor Santos and a few others at Brampton, we're seeing some progress and some signs of what could be in the 905. So Rowena, do you want to start off by talking a little bit about what's going on in Brampton?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you all for inviting me. And also, it's an honor to share this panel with the colleagues Nisha and Peter as well. I'm just going to first start off that I'm speaking to you from the Treaty Territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and I want to acknowledge the land of the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, as well as the Ojibwe, Chippewa people. This land is also home to the Métis, and I just, based on that land acknowledgement, just want to personally reflect and connect with all of you to let you know that as we are investigating some of the unmarked graves in Brantford, Ontario, as a mother, as a single mother, that really, it really touches me deeply, especially what has been happening and the stark reality of what we've been facing in our Indigenous history and Canada's history with them. So I just want to take that moment. I think sometimes we do land acknowledgements and then it becomes something that's by habit. And I've learned that when we pause to reflect and connect, it becomes more meaningful. That being said, I want to thank all the activists here. I actually, before becoming elected, was an activist and still am an activist now from the inside myself within the front lines of municipal government. And as the first Filipino elected in Brampton, I've experienced firsthand the increase in anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian racism amongst my sisters, my aunts, my colleagues, my friends who are also Asian. And I will say that it has been hard work on the front lines. We are the ones that people call most likely the first in order to address their concerns. And we have received a number of different concerns from the community on the ground in the various municipalities. At the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, I sit on the board. I'm one of a handful of people of color who sit on that board. And we were able to, in the last term of the FCM board, establish a committee on anti-racism and equity. And in that committee, we have been sharing a number of best practices across all the municipalities across the country. What is interesting is that depending if you're a small urban town in Canada or if you are a big urban center like Toronto or Brampton or Peel, your journey along the anti-Asian or the anti-racism to address anti-racism depends on where you are, if you're a small or large urban municipality. I'm so pleased to hear that there have been more resources dedicated to support the on-the-ground work. And I think it's important to note that we are privileged in large urban centers to have some level of resources to deal with this work by setting up, many of us are setting up equity offices, hiring equity officers, anti-racism committees, of which I am part of both in Brampton and the region of Peel. But if you are a small urban center, your journey is very different on this work. What I'm also finding on the ground as a municipality and being one of the only 2 women of color on council is that there's still a lot of conversations that are happening, still a lot of trying to understand and unpack the issue that is happening. And all of you are activists, all of you know that we've been fighting this fight for a really, really long time. And for me as an elected representative now, that balance between wanting to have things done now and why didn't this happen years ago, and why is it that people are just listening to us now, is something that I have to balance out with trying to find practical solutions and trying to educate some of my colleagues who don't necessarily have the same personal experiences that I have had on this journey, and struggle to eliminate racial discrimination and structural racism. And so, like, that's just some personal aspects. There are some very tangible things that the City of Brampton in particular is doing. I challenged as chair of community services. The fire department reports to me. Fire and emergency services is within my portfolio. And as you know, firefighters are seen as heroes, but they're also seen mostly as white men. And that level of systemic and structural hiring practices is strangely within the fire department in particular celebrated, because we all love firefighters. And so we took on at the City of Brampton to tackle on that particular department and their hiring practices and structural discrimination that exists within fire itself. And we're making incredible progress by introducing innovative and new ways to do community outreach and recruitment practices in order to better reflect the community that we serve here in Brampton. And once we tackle some of that big, huge issue, particularly with the department that is mostly reflective of white men, then we will see further improvements in our hiring practices everywhere else. And so those are just some very top line examples. The other thing that I would say that is a trend amongst municipalities is doing diversity audits. The region of Peel just completed a diversity audit internally of its employees, and as did the City of Brampton, even pre-COVID times in 2018. What we found was that while there is some level of representation within the employees as a whole, what is starking is that when you go up to manager, senior manager, commissioner level, senior leadership level, we aren't seeing as much representation at those leadership levels. And so finally, I will conclude that representation matters. It 100% matters. I have seen improvements in our diversity and equity and anti-racism approaches in Brampton and the region of Peel, because we have seen more representation and stronger voices at the table to advocate for it, not just to advocate for it, but who deeply understand it. And so representation matters, and I look forward to our conversation for the rest of this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowena. So we are at the halfway mark of the panel, and I do have two more questions. So the next part will be a briefer response from each of you. We definitely thank and appreciate the champions within the structures, and as people working within structures to have these changes made. It is a difficult work, and it is difficult work to be part of the change from within. At the same time, we also know that there's a lot more to be done. I always say we can only measure progress based on the magnitude of the problem, and the magnitude of the problem with racial inequities is costing us lives, literally lives every day. And so many of the approaches may be good, but do they fit the amount of response that is necessary? And I have no doubt that all three of you would want more, but you're working within the confines of what is there. But having said that, if you were wanting to do more, that I know you do, what are some of the challenges you're facing, and how are you navigating those challenges that are in the way of doing this work? Well, not just challenges individually, but also as a structure, as ARD, ARS, as an anti-racism committee within these levels of government. What are some challenges within? What are some societal challenges that are there that is preventing from us actually getting to the extent where we would see the net impact of these programs, because that is one of our challenges, because these programs are there, these interventions are there, the policies are being made, but at the other end, the impact is so high that we are not seeing, some elders come to our sessions and say, we had this conversation 20 years ago. Some elders would say we had the same conversation 40 years ago. And I might be sitting with my kids and telling the same thing if we don't scale up. So let me go to, I think I'll start with Rowena first. As a regional counselor and as a counselor, what are some of the barriers that you're facing structurally and societally in addressing this?
Thank you so much, Neethan, for that important question. I kind of touched on it a little bit and very quickly earlier in terms of some of the structural barriers that we have at the municipal level, whether that's Peel or in Brampton, is that because many of the senior levels of management and even that front bench on the city council bench are still predominantly white or white male in particular, the level of understanding and deep understanding of what it means to implement action when it comes to anti-racism is still not quite there. And I feel like in Brampton and Peel, perhaps in Toronto and other large municipalities in particular as well, we've gone from this shift of celebrating a celebration of diversity and culture from flag raisings and events to now more difficult conversations of what that actually means. And then also on top of, the realities of what we're facing because of colonialism in our own country here in Canada. And so because as my family, we're immigrants, as many of the activists here today, as we are all settlers to this land, we have such a different understanding compared to some of the folks who are in those leadership positions. So there's this education component that needs to happen. And when there's a deeper understanding of the issues and the impact on people like us and access to services and what that means in terms of equity, then folk that, or if there's an increase in representation at these leadership levels, then the policies might start to change. I have found that personally advocating for changes to policy as well. So I think that's one of the structural barriers. The other barrier is within society. And so when an activist like myself becomes elected in this position, I do feel like I want to do things right away, because why haven't we done this? Like, what is taking so long, I guess is my feeling. And as we do new things, like for example, in Brampton Fire, we started doing very specific community outreach sessions for recruitment purposes to the Black community, to the Asian community, to women, to the LGBTQ community, specific info sessions to join Brampton Fire to those communities. And when we did that, people criticized us for not doing enough, or criticized us for, well, how come you're not doing it in this community or this community? So we were criticized for not doing enough. And then we were also criticized for doing too much. From particularly folks from the white community who were saying, oh, okay, so I guess I'm not allowed to apply anymore to be a firefighter because all you care about is the BIPOC community. And so it challenges it in terms of implementing policy and moving the movement forward, so it has a very deep impact beyond cultural celebrations and beyond committee work. There's still a challenge structurally and within society because that pressure is really real. And when that pressure is so much, sometimes my colleagues and other counselors feel like, well, why should we do anything at all? Let's just not do anything because everyone's going to be mad.
Thanks, Rowena. Peter, I'll come to you. The work that Anti-Racism Secretary is doing is phenomenal, but the federal level is a huge jurisdictional level, a layer of relationships with Indigenous communities and what happens there around racial discriminations, employment-related, immigration-related challenges, foreign policy-related challenges. All of them are race relations related. So I know your scope is there, but you're also seen as multidisciplinary impact organization with them. So can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the challenges, your experiences in moving this forward?
Yeah. So the first part of your question was how are we navigating this? And I think it's important to understand our situation, our context. And so my compass and where I come to this work is as a queer great-great-grandson of freedom fighters who defeated the three most powerful empires of the 18th century to create the world's first independent Black nation, and Latin America and the Caribbean's first independent nation. So the history of resistance, but also of internationalism and bridging solidarity across communities is kind of the core of the lens and approach that I bring to this work of building that multidisciplinary and interdepartmental change that is so necessary to stamp out systemic racism in our society. And what we do know is culture change requires leadership. It requires sustained commitment to system change and meaningful and respectful engagement with communities with lived experience of racism and accountability frameworks and continuous learning. And it also involves putting into question the role that power plays in this area. So when we started, we realized first, because we're dealing with, as you say, the largest employer in Canada, over 300,000 employees in the federal public service, spanning, as you say, foreign relations to migration to public safety and the like. So we really needed to be intentional and strategic in our approach. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is through the development of an anti-racism framework, which is essentially the equivalent of anti-racism lens, but for many different business lines, so that we make sure that public servants are fully equipped to apply anti-racism considerations, from grants and contributions to procurement to policy and the like. Another way is through MC reviews. The Prime Minister asked that the Federal Secretariat review every single memorandum to cabinet. And so for those who know, a memorandum to cabinet is basically the first step to seeing a policy, a program, a service, or a law get approved by the Prime Minister and cabinet. So we select which ones we can see, because obviously we can't see every single one, but really looking to see whether it's in migration, international affairs, or what have you, that anti-racism considerations are effectively embedded. And then of course is offering training to public servants and the like to make sure that in addition to having these tools at their disposal, there's continuous learning. So they're continuously being informed by bringing in subject matter experts from communities with lived experience of racism across the board. So in terms of the risks, when we're talking this work is of long-term system change, it can be scary, it disrupts, it challenges the pre-existing beliefs, and it highlights power imbalances. So not everyone's going to be happy about it. So there's always a risk of a backlash, trying to turn back the clock, putting the anti-racism genie back in the bottle. There's always the risk of finding ways to water down or subsume this critical work under other categories, if I can say, or minimizing or sidelining the work. There's a risk of misunderstanding and essentially continuing the status quo, so maintaining the systemic barriers. So that's why, as I said at the onset, it's so critical that we can continue working together to make sure that the critical work and the advancements and the change that we have seen continues and is sustainable over time.
Great, thank you, Peter, for that overview of having assessed where their traps or the challenges may be, and trying to find ways to navigate it as a structure within the government. Nisha, I'll come to you. As somebody who spearheaded the campaign earlier to get the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate back after the 90s, many of us in the community were elated to see, and then we were also very happy to see that it was followed up with the legislation, because that's critical as well. And to a certain extent, some of us have felt like, are we at the fullest extent where it could be, and what's the path to go there? And it's not necessarily any reflection of the amazing work that's being done, but it is something, because health and education are critical areas of Ontario jurisdiction, and that seems to be like reoccurring kind of, and obviously policing. So I wanted to come to you to talk about, how do you see your role and your directorate's role evolving, growing in future, and how you as a team plan to navigate some of the challenges that society and the systems put in front of you?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it's critical that we continue to have what's needed to manage a moving target. I think that's one of the big challenges, if I can sort of put it that way, in working in the public service. There are sometimes there will be a moving target, and whether that is, the cycle, the political cycle, or the issue of the day, or the priority, or just the responsibility of the public service to respond to particular things. It is often a challenge to manage that moving target. So I think the legislative framework, the anti-racism data standards, really does allow the stability of that moving target. At the very least, that there are these components of a particular change approach, if you will, that really do support that going forward. So that would be my, one of the challenges is that moving target. And I think the response is, how do we ensure and how do we continue to ensure that there are some pillars that allow that moving target to be stable? And that means that although the target moves, the strategy has to be to align to priorities and to align to government priorities, which I think is really important. And in order to do that, it's as I've sort of centered in the previous response, it's important that the ARD continue to collaborate with communities and continue to work with those that can speak about the issues, can provide solutions, can also continue to create the tension on the particular issues. So that's a really big part of the work that we would want to do, and we continue to do, is how do we make sure that we continue to have that dialogue and that open space to maintain that tension on and allowing the target not to move too far. A big challenge I do want to speak to, though, on is a little bit around measuring outcomes. And I think that is, we're, as I think has been noted, the ARD has been around a little bit longer. And at the 5-year mark, we're being asked to sort of reflect, okay, what have you been able to achieve? What has actually happened? And that's a tough question when you're dealing with a systemic issue that is so complex, where you can't talk about health outside of economic recovery. You can't talk about education outside of policing. You can't talk about, there's such a complex issue. It is a very, very challenging thing to do. So one of the things I think to say is, we are doing one of the things to do, one of the things to reflect, is how we measure progress and how to look at it both from a short term, a medium term, and a long term game, right? This is the progress of change, measuring culture change, measuring systemic change really is a short, medium, long-term strategy, and really starting to think about that. So the progress reports that the Anti-Racism Directorate and the province of Ontario have published over the last 2 years will give folks a bit of an idea of the kinds of initiatives. And, really looking ahead into the next 5 years, when we get to the mark of a decade, I would want us, and I think the government, wants to ensure that there is a narrative that looks beyond an initiative-based approach in measuring, but really looking at what are the systemic levers and where is the systemic change. So that's one that I think is really, really important in the measuring of outcomes, measuring of progress and outcomes. Partly that I think has to do with understanding how we change the narrative on what is a positive outcome. I'm often floored by the idea that we give food banks more resources if they can show that they're feeding more people. And I think just that simple idea of like we resource things that are not dealing with the core issue and continue to just perpetuate. And so really thinking about how to do that in a different way. The pandemic awakening, as you folks have said, have brought in a conversation around areas of further opportunity. And I think that in the next 5 years, it will be on the Anti-Racism Directorate and all parties really that are parties is all stakeholders and partners, to really be part of the conversation of shifting into a more complex narrative on measuring progress across the various sectors and looking at an outcome-based approach.
Awesome, thank you very much. So a quick comment from Councillor Santos quickly, and then we'll move on to the last part of it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Neethan. And I'm going to have to agree with Nisha on that one in terms of one of the barriers is absolutely measuring progress and outcome and what that means. Because for council and for us at the municipal level, that is a key driver when it comes to where we're going to be putting our resources. And that's also in the provincial and the federal level as well. And so if measuring progress comes down to number crunching, That's difficult because this is all new work that we're doing. So measuring progress is so important to figure out what that means in this work. And then also, obviously, the resources at the municipal level, we're implementing all of these plans and we have all these plans, but it's not covered necessarily within our revenue structure to pay for these things. And so the provincial federal government, we need help to start implementing some of this work.
Definitely. Thank you. So we have one last question for all three of you, probably about 2 to 3 minutes. The question has to do with, today we are joined by 130 or so people who are working on the ground. Many of them are working on the ground, and they are the voices on the ground, stakeholders, grassroots organizers, and so on. I want to ask you what you have in your plans to engage, or what's happening right now in engaging those voices to kind of continue to have the government policy be grounded with ground realities and be relevant and responsive. So that's a 2-minute, 3-minute question. I know it could be longer, but before we go to that, I actually wanted to pull up a slide that shows how the breakout sessions would work. So there's 3 breakout sessions, and it is jurisdictionally divided. So we have Councillor Rowena Santos will be in the municipal, and Nisha Haji will be in provincial, and Peter Flegel will be in the federal breakout. And those who are joining through app, you would have a prompt where you can choose which group you join in. But those who are using a browser, if you can rename yourself, keep your name, but beside that put either MUNPROV or FED beside your name, then we know exactly where to assign you. So it makes it faster that you will get into your room faster. But everybody who's here will get into a room, don't worry, but we'll make sure that that's done faster if you are able to do that renaming now. If you're not sure, if you're not joining from an app would give you that option. So let's go back to the question. And I'm going to start with Rowena here, and 2 to 3 minutes. We have about 10 minutes left in this session. So how are community voices being engaged and included into the decision making around anti-racism?
So we do have an equity office at the City of Brampton, and even before that, we established our own anti-Black racism office and task force to deal with anti-Black racism very specifically. And so there has been an incredible amount of work done for outreach in the community to have conversations and collect feedback about how they feel regarding anti-racism work at the City of Brampton, what the concerns are, where they feel the barriers are within the community, and particularly again within fire and other departments like within public works, as well as within community services. We are starting to change our recruitment processes. I saw that somebody had mentioned hosting hiring sessions within the underrepresented communities. We are starting to do that in Brampton now, and we are doing very targeted outreach within these underrepresented communities. And so that is part of the process for us. That's just a couple of examples. I'm happy to speak more about it if folks ask in the breakout rooms.
Thank you very much, Rowena. I'll go to Peter. Nisha next. Nisha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think I've spoken to this a lot. I will just say briefly, there is no anti-racism work without community voice. There just isn't. And I think it's really, really important that we continue to do that, particularly for the Anti-Racism Directorate. We find all the opportunities that we can to engage with, to partner with, and to really allow for that striking the right power imbalance, if you will, or striking the right power balance, I will say, so that we can make the change in the short, medium, and long term. Particularly, I will say, community engagement is embedded within the Anti-Racism Act. We are required to hear from Indigenous, Black, Jewish, Muslim, and other racialized folks that are impacted by systemic racism in the work that we do. And so in the next little while, as we look to review the provincial anti-racism strategy, we will be looking for opportunities to engage to hear from and to bring folks to the table in the process so that we can have a very strong community-informed process. I will also say that I think it's really important for us in government to consider how we not only engage, but how engagement moves into partnership, and how it also works in partnership in delivery, because there are, as to sort of speak to some of those moving targets, there are some things we just don't have the same level of expertise, and we just don't have the same level of credibility and reach, frankly, to do. And so really thinking about, as we look to engage, really looking at an engagement framework that's beyond tell us what you think, because frankly, folks have told us what they think too many times. And we really do need to think about how we move from, tell us what you think and how can we work together to make change. So really that would be my message on community engagement. And I really am looking forward to hearing from people in the next strategy.
Thank you very much, Nisha. That is definitely a distinction that we need to promote more of, what community engagement means and what collaboration and partnership and co-creating, co-delivering methods look like. Peter, you want to go next and give us a little bit of an overview of entry points for community within your structure and systems?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I have to echo what my colleagues have said. I think for us at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, the mantra, nothing about us without us, must anchor all the work that's being done in terms of policy development, program development, service or legislative development. For starters, at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, hiring is a key way in which we ensure that communities at the table. That's intentional hiring, making sure that we have 95% racialized, indigenous, and religious minority employees, making sure that that a lot of them actually come from community, have a community development experience and expertise, and we bring them into the government to make sure that informs the work across government, and then promote them to other opportunities and other developments so that they become ambassadors of the good anti-racism message across the board. And so ensuring that conduit between community and into government is really key from our perspective. And then engagement, community engagement, as has been mentioned, is also key at all levels of the process. So from the iteration, the conceptualization, to the development, to the implementation and the monitoring, we try to make sure that across the board that communities are involved. And we've reached out to and been able to engage over 400,000 Canadians across the country, and hope to continue expanding that, just to make sure that it's really, as I said, nothing about us without us, and ensuring that the engagement is meaningful and it actually translates into a tangible policy, program, service, and legislative change.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the three of you for taking the time to be here. The next 1 hour, we'll be able to go into details and a bit more interactive sessions and reimagining what progress would look like. I think it's important to maybe tweak certain things that we are doing, but also have the space to imagine a vision that might not be currently present. We heard a lot about commitment to disaggregated data. We heard a lot about using that disaggregated data as a tool for transformative change. So hopefully, that continues to be the direction. We heard a lot about government supporting grassroots as well as community initiatives to build this work together, to do the work by the people who are best suited to do the work. Structural hiring practices. There were a lot of mentions about professional development for staff. There's a lot to be done. And we see the three of you who are here. I know this is not a government panel. And the reason is that we are not necessarily addressing the broader government inequities through this panel. We see you as champions from the government. And in the piece of, in the puzzle around systemic change, champions internally who are spearheading this work is important part of the puzzle. So we see this as a conversation with allies in that conversation. So that's partly why some of the more difficult and more targeted questions that needs to be addressed to the leadership of these governments aren't necessarily addressed to you. And we will continue the same format within the breakout. But I do want to finish off by saying that there's definitely a lot more work to be done at all three levels. There's definitely a lot more prioritizing that needs to be done, where the priorities should be, the recent announcement at different levels of government on where investment is going and where investment is not going. is not necessarily heartening when we hear 3.6 million, for example, provincially, and then millions of dollars in policing, for example, and what is happening with Indigenous relations at the federal level. Municipally, there still seems to be a lot of tokenism around, diversity work. So all three levels have issues, and it's not partisan issues because it doesn't matter who has been in power. It's always been governments trying to protect status quo in many of these places. So I know I don't want to finish off on a negative kind of thing, but it is important to contextualize, US allies are an important part of this puzzle, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that we continue to hold our governments accountable to have the scale and the magnitude of solutions that we require. So thank you very much. And we'll now go into our breakout sessions. Thank you to all three speakers.